Welcome to Cycling and Society 2021. Great to see you, especially if you've just arrived and this is your first panel session. What you can see on the screen are the panels that will take place over the 2 days. So anything that you might have missed there that you think might look interesting, or things that you can't make, definitely advise you to go onto the website and have a look for recordings. This session is called Perspectives on Space and Communication. If you haven't done already, the presentations have been made into videos, which are all installed on the website. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be discussing those presentations, and you'll have the chance to ask questions of the panelists, who I'm going to let introduce themselves in just 1 second. But just before I do that, I would just want to quickly go over a couple of bits of housekeeping very, very quickly, and then we'll get into it. Okay, so first of all, in a second, we're going to hear from each panelist. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, give their affiliation and the title of their research or the video. Following that, they're going to each get 2 or 3 minutes to give a brief synopsis of the video. And then I'm going to open it up for question and answers. Now, just to make sure, I'm sure you're all very au fait with Zoom now. I know I am, just about. But just to make sure that you operate everything properly, use the chat section to fire questions in as and when. I will start to look at those once everyone's introduced themselves and their video, and then I'll start to pick them out, and I'll give you the chance to, if you want, turn on your video and your microphone and ask the question yourself, or if not, I can ask it for you. Just to make sure that I can see that it's definitely a question and it's not just a general comment. If you're going to ask a question, please can you put a Q in front of it, and then I'll be able to quickly navigate to find it. And just to also say it's being recorded and it's going to be placed on the website as well. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to go around the presenters first of all, and I'm going to go in the order that they appear on the website. So apologies, Paolo, it's you first. Can you just quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, no problem. Hello, everyone. It's so great to be here and see both familiar and new faces. People who I've met online and haven't had the chance to meet offline, regrettably. My name is Paola Castañeda. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. And I co-wrote this book chapter with Sergio Montero, who is an associate professor at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. And the title of our chapter is not very creative. It's Making Space for Cycling. The editors of the Routledge Cycling Companion asked us to write on this topic. Well, they actually asked Sergio, and then he invited me to jump on board. And the first thing that when we sat down to discuss is, like, we agreed we don't want to think about making space for cycling just in terms of building infrastructure, even if we both greatly appreciate and wholeheartedly support building infrastructure. But what we wanted to do was think a little bit outside the box and think about all of the other ways that we can think about space and that we can think about cycling. And so think about different ways that support and make for robust societies where cycling can happen and flourish. And so in that regard, I think we complemented each other really well, because Sergio's work on policy mobilities allows him to see how institutions or different kinds of actors mobilize cycling to position it as a good alternative and convince city planners and government officials that cycling is the way to go. So in that regard, Sergio's work about Ciclovia was very influential in how we decided to frame this conversation. And he suggested we talk about urban experiments, right? And making space for experimentation in cities, not just so that people can have like a one-off experience of what a cycling city or certain cycling configurations can look like, but actually if you have a recurrent experiment, then it becomes sedimented, I think, in some way in people's minds and in the city's tradition of of cycling. And so Ciclovia in that regard is just a perfect example because it allows people in Bogota to participate weekend after weekend after weekend. Of course, there's a lot to disentangle there as to whether or not this has actually had an effect on rising cycling rates. But we also talked about policy spaces, because we think that in addition to having good infrastructure, you need robust institutions and policies that will support that cycling. And you need, mayors and the different kinds of actors involved in this, involved and actively involved in helping sustain cycling in the long term, because you can build wonderful infrastructure and then let it go to waste if you don't make that a policy priority, for example. And then finally, we discussed activist spaces, because we think that the ways in which people are creating and inventing urban futures is very valuable, because it is from people's own desires that cycling can also come into being. So I think in many ways, the contribution that we're making is, to think about space as more than physical space. And in that sense, we drew on Henri Lefebvre to think about the different kinds of spaces that together make, the space that we see and we inhabit and we experience. And we also thought about cycling as more than, hopping on your bike and pedaling the pedals. But actually, if you think about community bike shops as something that enables cultural cycling, I guess, is a good way to express that, or feminist cycling spaces that allow women in some way to overcome or find support to overcome the different barriers to cycling that we experience, and to find a community of support that will enhance and enable cycling in the long term. So I guess that's pretty much an overview of the video. Thank you very much.
That's great, Paola. Thank you very much. And it was a really good video. If anyone hasn't watched it, it just showed the different ways of looking at space and how they're all important. We need to consider them. So I'm just going to move on really quickly. And it's Ian's turn now to give us a few minutes of his research.
Hi, so my name is Ian Cookson. I'm a PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University. My PhD is in social identity and transport choice. It's actually 3 studies. So the first one I presented here is about the thematic analysis of newspaper representations of cyclists. So this takes, so rather than an individual perspective on cycling, the overarching theory around my PhD is about social identity, about group identity. And this first one looks at how newspapers represent cyclists. So the findings really, it's probably no surprise, but it talks about the fact that it's written from an in-group perspective. So the journalists are motorists and they write from that perspective. And they are writing about cyclists as outsiders. So there's very much an othering of cyclists in all the representations. And I identified really 6 themes, so 6 representations, and they are the activist, criminal, people who lead really rich cultural lives, healthy bodies, the outdoors person, and the transporters. So that othering really manifests in these representations being quite extreme examples. So in the healthy bodies theme, for example, it's talking about people who are doing, very extreme events, or they are constantly exercising. So it's presenting cyclists in very extreme ways rather than motoring, which hardly gets any coverage. I think it would have been interesting, because this was conducted kind of pre-pandemic, it would have been interesting to see how that shifted and changed over the course of the pandemic. But the other thing I think to note is that transport or utility cycling, I should say, is very, very small. It's a very small part of this analysis. And that again reinforces that point that these journalists are writing from a motoring perspective. They identify as motorists, and that's driving how they write about cycling and motoring in terms of transport. There was another comparison I drew with some work by Michael Billig about nationalism, and he talked about how that kind of real extreme nationalism, the kind of far right nationalism of flag waving, and skinheads and that kind of example of nationalism has to be backgrounded against a more banal version of nationalism. So the nationalism we see in flags, in currency, in stamps, in maps. And there's a similar theme coming through in how journalists write about cycling. It's that very extreme example of transport compared to that very banal backgrounding of motoring as a form of transport. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And once again, yeah, a really interesting piece of research. Certainly the different types that you've identified there are things that we all have seen, and the way that you've kind of been able to flesh that out and explain them in your videos, I thought really interesting. So the next person is Pedro, who is actually colleague of Vera, who can't make it today. So I'm going to pass over to you, Pedro.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, 2 notes. The one Nicole already shared. So Vera was the main researcher. So I'm representing her because she wasn't able to come. She had a personal issue and she wasn't able to come, which is a loss for all of us, because my very best is probably her worst. So we all lost from that. Secondly, I'm really rusty in my English, so I'm sorry for any miscommunication, and I will try my best. I'm from Porto, from Escola Superior de Educação do Porto. I have a PhD in education, and I'm the newest research from this group of the bicycle and its educational potential. The research is based on previous researchers already development, namely from a previous one from 2018, I believe. And it came from Vera, who is valuable mobility in every day. So she's used to think about bicycle and the way she is interconnected with her. She does social work with the bicycle. She's promoting, she's working with other people who want to make bicycle everyday life issue, and she started a research in that way. But the research is organic process, and from now on we have a new research named Bipedal that we are developing specifically in the INED, which is the research center from Escola Superior de Educação do Porto, and we are trying to understand, and the video is about that, the potential, the educative potential of the bicycle, not in a limited way of thinking of the educational potential, but in a wide range of subjects. The group is a really ample group, really diverse. We have people from the sports, we have people from inclusive education, we have people from sociology, in my case, citizenship education. So we have a broad focus of the project. In the process, we are analyzing the views of higher education students about uses of the bicycle and the educative potential that there is in there. And mainly we can see that the students have a broader idea of potential process as well, because we see related to geographical conscious, for example, related to social skills, related to sustainability, to idea of self-ownership, and in some way, not that explicit, the idea of body-mind. So we are trying to discuss this, and we're trying to discuss the way the educative potential of the bicycle can too be related to the idea of right of the city. And we are trying to discuss and think about that. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Pedro. And yeah, absolutely. Watch the video, everyone. It's extremely evocative. There's one sentence that Vera did a much better job than I am doing now of saying, but the motor car basically it's pushing people away from considering their body and their mind, which is what we would be doing if we weren't surrounded by cars in the urban sphere. So last but not least, Thomas, would you like to quickly discuss your research?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And hello to everybody. This is my first academic conference, so it's a very exciting opportunity. I'm Thomas. I've been living in Bogota for 4 years now. I am Dutch, but I started thinking about cycling more seriously here. So I've been working with a local NGO called Despacio, very interesting work on different cycling and sustainable mobility projects, but with a focus on infrastructure in different Latin American cities. So my presentation focuses on a couple of Colombian cases and how infrastructure has become, on the one hand, very political, and cycling itself is also very much political here in Colombia, especially when I compare it to the Netherlands, where it's something perhaps much more apolitical. And on the other hand, how infrastructure influences cycling practices, and what are the practices of designing infrastructure as well. So how that has evolved in Colombia, which is often held as and Paula can speak to that, a best case for cycling in global South context, but there's much more, it's much more complex below the surface, and it's also a very dynamic area of work. Infrastructure being built right now is not the same as 20 years ago, and it's a very interesting thing to study. So I'll be starting a PhD at the University of Manchester this year, starting in September. So this is my my start for my academic endeavor. So it's very exciting to be here once again. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas. That's brilliant. And again, I loved watching your video. I love the way that you're on location in quite a lot of it as well. Again, 4 fantastic videos, 4 fantastic presentations. So now what I'd like to do is, first of all, I'd like to encourage people in the audience to post their questions in the chat. There aren't any there at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question to all of you. Probably go around you, actually, if that's, go around the group and ask the same question. What I noticed when I watched all of the presentations was that there was a theme that cut across all of them, and it was that of marginalization in space, in very different ways for each of the four videos, I felt. So what I'd like to ask you, based on your research and based on your kind of local situation, what do you think the solution is to this issue? What are the ways that we can facilitate cycling for all? And in no particular order, because it's on the screen from left to right. I've got Ian at the top, so I'm going to ask you first.
I think Thomas has just touched on it, and I noticed this theme, from a slightly different angle, but in those countries where you have a greater percentage of cyclists, it has become apolitical. It's quite normal. It doesn't really come through in my first study, but in my second study, I heard that a lot from people that I interviewed, that the normative behavior in a particular location really influences, whether they adopt cycling or not. So I think there needs to be, from a social identity perspective, there needs to be a demonstration through the media, through leadership, that cycling is something that we all do, we all take part in. It's something, rather than this maintenance of the car as the norm.
Great, thanks very much, Ian. I've got next Pedro, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, from our research, we identify a few of things that are interesting. First of all, is cultural elements. So we don't have in Porto a culture of using the bicycle as a mobility, but we have a culture that associates bicycle with childhood, for example, and we have a lot of reports that the students, when thinking about the bicycle, they associate with their own experience as childs, and normally as a plaything, not a way of transportation. Secondly, we have a few of political actions related to tourism. So we have reports that some of the infrastructure that are being built is related to ways of enjoying the beach, for example, that are related to ciclovias exactly on the beach and places like that, but they are not a useful solution to everyday life, because most of us don't have a close relation with the beach in our daily lives, and we needed a more range approach on the political infrastructure that was debated too in the previous panel, I believe. And the third aspect that I think is interesting to know and to think about is related to the educative process. We don't have a tradition in Portugal, nor in Porto in particularly to have bicycle as a sport, or bicycle as a complementary or curriculum approach in the schools. We are trying to, we as a project, and we as a nation, to have an approach about that. In the summer was approved a political plan in introduction of the bicycles in the curriculum, more or less, and we are trying to create bicycle roads or bicycle trains for students to go to school in bicycle, and the schools to promote that kind of approach. So here, in relation to the question, we have a cultural process, and a cultural process, not exactly a cultural background that enable us to have more, less. Sorry, we have a cultural background that doesn't enable us to see bicycle as a real solution or a real approach to mobility instead of the car. And we have now trying to think with the project as how the car created a city that dehumanizes as persons and as individuals who believe in the right of the city. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Pedro. The next person I've got on the screen is Paula.
That's a great question. I think that's, the question that many of us are thinking about and trying to answer in some way. And I think a useful point of departure for answering is thinking about cycling, as Pedro was just mentioning, right, as embedded within specific cities and cultures and mindsets and attitudes towards cycling. So obviously there's no single answer for every context. And I think it's very different to speak, for example, of Bogota than to speak of any other city in Latin America, right? I think in that sense, Bogota is a little bit exceptional. Maybe Thomas can tell us more whether he agrees or not. So I think, yeah, I mean, starting from seeing cycling as embedded within a system that isn't just a transportation system, but it's also a cultural and political economic system that favors certain kinds of mobilities over others. And I say this coming from my background in mobility studies, which obviously, gives us a perspective that kind of forces us to look at, this kind of, at this kind of stuff through through a lens, thinking about power relations, thinking about power asymmetries and how they manifest in mobility, and understanding cycling as something that has been, at some point, cycling itself marginalized, but then cyclists themselves, different kinds of cyclists, are marginalized in some spaces and some historical contexts. And so I'm thinking here, for example, here in Latin America, the bicycle has always been around since it was invented, since it was introduced into the region, and it hasn't gone away. It's just sort of, gone beneath the surface. And it sometimes feels that in the effort to make the bicycle cool again, there are processes of marginalization at play, because you have to construct, you construct certain mobilities as desirable and others as undesirable. And so you have all of these, historical users of cycles and subsistence cyclists who end up being marginalized. And of course, this isn't the case everywhere and every time, but these are things that I have noticed in the course of my research of the ways in which trying to frame the bicycle as cool and recover it from precarity in some ways and from poverty, and dislocate it from its association as the vehicle of the poor, can end up having detrimental effects in terms of mobility justice and accessibility and cycle equity and inclusion. And so I think it would be very helpful to think about, who is being marginalized and how, who am I not seeing, who is not being represented, and ask them, right? And I think that when we think about, for example, women and gender non-conforming people, the common sense is that we want more infrastructure to feel safer when we cycle. But recently, a number of colleagues in Chile found that women are more averse to cycling infrastructure. And so the question is, why, right? Why do these common sense solutions sometimes not align with the common sense? So I think that it's again a matter of looking at how cycling is embedded within a capitalist, neoliberal, patriarchal system that circumscribes our mobilities and produces cycling subjects in ways that some people are rendered more mobile or immobile and not others.
Thank you very much, Paula. Again, last but not least, sorry, Thomas, it's you last again, but please do let us know what you think.
No worries. Also turn the order around so others can respond to me, perhaps, the next question. But I think I would like to answer this question based on the two contexts I know the best. So obviously I'm Dutch, so I've grown up cycling in the Netherlands, which is not seeing it. It's something basically invisible. The bicycle is an extension of your body. If you get stolen, it's terrible. It's like losing a leg. But it's not. So there's a question here in the chat that says, well, can you elaborate on the notion of cycling as political? Well, I'd say this is what apolitical is when it's so common and it's not really discussed even. It's something that is not in conflict with other modes either. I mean, coming from other places, it's difficult to say, okay, how can it be that cycling is not a competition with cars? But the traffic system in the Netherlands is so designed that you never really have to clash at all. And the reduction of space for cars is it's part of the street design. There's no questions asked about it. Obviously, back a few decades back, it was very much political in the Netherlands. And because of this political process, starting in the 70s, of reclaiming space for cycling, we can now live it in an apolitical way. I think there's certain downsides to that, and perhaps this is something very interesting to kind of explore, is to say, well, what do we lose when cycling becomes apolitical? Here in Bogota, in Colombia in general, I'd say, Bogota isn't that unique within the Colombian context. To respond to Paula, I think there's other cities in Colombia that are doing similar things to Bogota, and there's cities even where there's more cyclists, such as Monteria. And many of these cities are implementing cycling infrastructure and public bicycle systems and other kinds of programs. And it's, as far as I've seen, it's not really related to a political party at all. The right-wing party or left-wing party, everyone promotes cycling. But it is very much contested. So when we go and we say, okay, we're going to put a cycling lane in the street, that becomes very much contested, and it's very political. And it's cycling itself is used as a way to say, okay, we're doing things about mobility, we're doing things to make our city more green. So it becomes this way to show we're progressing, we're moving forward. And so perhaps this is the interesting thing about Colombia, is that it's on the political agenda. So in terms of government policy, it's there, but the implementation is what really becomes hotly contested. Cycling activism is obviously much more present here because conditions are so poor, and aside from the lack of cycling infrastructure, there's the risk of robbery, and there's all kinds of major issues facing cyclists here that are not faced by a cyclist in the Netherlands, for instance. And I think that speaks to what happens in countries like the UK as well. I mean, it's your daily experience, maybe perhaps to relate this as well to the research of Vera and Pedro, is in the Netherlands, cycling is boring. There's nothing that really, you know, you don't really encounter anything that bothers you. Perhaps there's a lack of parking. You know, that's probably the major issue. And so you don't really create a political consciousness about it. Whereas if you cycle around Bogota, you notice that you are marginalized. You're getting abused. You don't have space. You have to watch out for all sorts of dangers. So it's a very different experience of cycling. So I hope that also responds to Ida's question about how I consider cycling to be more political in some contexts than others.
Yeah, absolutely, and the marginalization issue as well. And for very, it shows how the complexity and the context-specific nature of marginalization, with all of the different answers that you've given us. Funnily enough, I've just been scrolling through the questions, and I found a question from Mauricio, who might want to ask the question themselves, if you're there, Mauricio. About it follows on from what you've just said there, Thomas, and it's to all panelists, I think.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, yep. So so my question was actually partly answered by Thomas just a moment ago, and it's, you know, how can cities, I live in France actually, and in Paris here, cycling infrastructure is such a political issue that it's hard to see the end of it. So how can cities move from this being as such a political and such a strong political issue to what you said in the Netherlands being just part of everyday life? Or like some of the comments say in the comment section, we're saying that it's not just apolitical, but it's actually political in a way, but that it doesn't really talk about whether we should or should not have cycling infrastructure, but how do we have, or how do we implement the cycling infrastructure? So my question is merely if this apoliticization will happen inherently as model share increases, or is there something that needs to be done more purposefully to create this apolitical environment? Thank you.
So anyone can answer that one, I guess.
Can I answer to this?
Yes, please. Yes.
I'm just really interested in the topic of cycling being political. The topic of my PhD is cycling activism in Latin America. And the number one thing that people always say is cycling is political. And I think that we can interpret that in so many ways. And I'm just quite surprised that we are discussing that whether it is not political or apolitical, because I think that at the end of the day, even the most technical aspect of, you know, designing the infrastructure, even those things that we associate with the technocratic dimension of cycling are political in the sense that they relate to the production and distribution of space. I mean, we're literally talking about redistributing space and reorganizing ourselves in cities. And it's difficult to think of anything that is more politically contentious, that how humans organize ourselves in space and how we organize space, how we codify it, how we think about it. All of these things respond to ideological perceptions of what we think space is and what it is for and what are appropriate or adequate or desirable mobilities. I think it would be, I think it would be misguided, for example, to say that driving is not political, because it's so common, right? I look out my window and there's like a million cars out there in traffic choked streets, and I mean there's this continuous feeding back into the system of automobility, right? So and those things are political. They're geopolitical in the sense that automobility is oil dependent, and they're also geopolitical in the sense that car manufacturing and all these kinds of things build up a world system. So why wouldn't cycling be political if it is proposing an alternative way of movement, and movement as a fundamental aspect of how we construct ourselves as subjects? But also, it's proposing an alternative model of how we design space and organize space. So in that sense, it is, a political issue in contesting a political system, which is automobility, right? And there's Claudio. Hi, Claudio. He's saying cycling is also political in so much as it distributes power and highlights certain social groups while ignoring others.
Yeah, I can see that you sparked something off there, Paula. In the comments, there's plenty of answers coming through.
Could I also
Please do
interject? I think it's a very welcome correction to the terminology. Definitely, it's not apolitical in that sense. Depoliticized, I think, yes, is the better word. So thanks for that from Peter and from Paula. But I would say that in terms of the way that modes conflict, I think is probably the most saliently political issue, usually for cycling. So in terms of the UK or here in Colombia, when modes come into conflict is when we start to get these sorts of media storms as well. LTNs. Here in Colombia, it's ever more common, these kinds of protests against cycling lanes, and this is when modes interact and come into conflict. And in the Netherlands, the design has created this system where you don't really come into conflict at all. And this doesn't mean it's apolitical in that sense, but it's definitely depoliticized. And one of the things that we often forget about the Netherlands is that it is a paradise for driving your car. It's consistently rated the best place to drive. It has one of the highest densities of highways in Europe. There's a ton of highways everywhere. So sometimes, for instance, here in Colombia, people assume, oh, well, you got rid of all the cars and it's only bikes in your cities. So that's amazing. It's great. You took away all the space from the cars and now there's no more cars. No, there's huge highways everywhere. And yes, the city centers are very human oriented, but there's these massive highway projects around the cities. And so in a way, by separating the modes, the Netherlands has made it possible to create this auto paradise at the same time as creating a cycling paradise. This isn't possible in Bogota, right? We can't make a massive highway network here in Bogota. There's the resources, we don't have the resources, we don't have the space either. So it's necessarily more conflictual, this kind of infrastructural change that's necessary here to promote cycling. I would say, at least as far as I can compare these two contexts, but I think the Netherlands is in many ways also a warning or a kind of a anti-utopia in many cases, because it's seen as this kind of example of this, we won the war on cars. Well, no, we didn't. We put the cars in one place and we put the bikes in another place. We didn't have the war in the first place.
Thank you very much. There are lots of questions are coming in, and I'm going in a bit of a strange order here, but I've got one here from Judy about pedestrians. Again, when we're talking about contested spaces, pedestrians are often discussed. Judy, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah. Been a lot of talk about cyclists against motorists. Was wondering about cyclists versus pedestrians. Doing a lot of work in Greater Manchester through Chris Boardman, trying to make the city region cycle and walking friendly. But I think there is the feeling maybe amongst pedestrians that particularly we've got a really good canal system. It would be a really good way of getting into the city. But there's not room for cyclists and pedestrians because cyclists don't ring their bells. And so I'm just thinking that that's a third part of the equation that hasn't been discussed. So be interested to see what people think. I don't, it wasn't political like it said in the chat. I come from a town with 3 Green councillors and one of them rides on the pavement because he says it's safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. So yeah, again, it's for everyone really, this question. If you've got something you would like to say.
Yeah, I think I can speak to this one because I live in Greater Manchester and I know exactly what Judy's talking about. I think Chris Boardman said you've got to take politicians into the wind tunnel with you for them to understand what's required. And I think he's right, because I think they need to experience, and again, it comes back to this idea that they're all motorists predominantly, a lot of the politicians, and so they don't understand those dynamics if you're out on a bike or you're walking. But ironically, we're all pedestrians at some point. Even if you're going to your car or going to get your bike, everyone's a pedestrian. So that space, from what I've heard people talking about, is possibly the most important part of the puzzle. But again, it comes back to that political discussion you've just been having, because a lot of the councils, the local councils, will, to save money in the budgets, create shared space. So they won't have budget for segregated cycleways. So they'll use canal towpaths, they'll use shared space, and they'll force that conflict between pedestrians and cyclists.
Thank you very much, Ian. I've also got Pedro's got his hand up as well.
Yeah, I have, I think, an interesting thing to share is in our focus group, one of the words the students related to the cycling was fear. Exactly on the point that Judy made related to the way cycling can create fear on the pedestrians. And some of them already had those experiences as child, for example, to be run over by a bicycle, and they have feared that has happened again. Interesting what we are seeing in the focus group as well is that the relation with automobility isn't exactly the same, because normally when as an accident between a pedestrian and a bicycle, they assume the responsibility of the bicycle. When there is an accident between a automobile and a bicycle, they assume the responsibility of the bicycle as well. So it's kind interesting to see how the bicycle has the worst of the two worlds, because the responsibility is normally assumed to be on the velomobility.
Great, thank you very much, Pedro. I'm going to stay with you actually, Pedro, because in my kind of scrolling back and forth, I've found another one for you and Vera, but obviously she's not here. It's from Claudio, so I'll ask if Claudio can come in and ask the question first of all.
Hi, sure. Hi, Pedro. I liked your and Vera's video a lot. I'm constantly thinking about education and pedagogy, especially with as framed as cycling activism. Sometimes when we do activism, we're really engaging in pedagogic practices, both with interested parties and with non-interested parties. So that that takes us into education literature that deals with relations of power when one is doing the educating, when there's teachers and students. So it immediately brought me to Paulo Freire and this idea of, yes, I agree, I totally agree with we should introduce cycling into communities and in schools and young people, because the way it is sort of taught and messaged today is very much autocentric, but still there's this threat of us only communicating sort of the normative versions of cycling that don't give space for communities to define cycling themselves and to appropriate whatever cycling means to them or is useful to them. So that's more or less my extended version of the question, if you've thought about that.
That's a really interesting question. We have a problem in pedagogy, especially when we think about schools. It is related exactly to that, and the way the curriculum as a formal text can enhance this kind of inequalities and power relations that are not exactly pedagogical in the broader sense. The way I was thinking about curriculum in my answer backstage was related to curriculum as lived, not exactly as a text, because the bicycle isn't in the formal curriculum yet. We have a program was approved in July, I believe, where the students can engage in bicycle as a sport promoted by schools, but is from their choice. So they don't really need to do it if they don't want. But the government will, theoretically, we don't know if that's the problem nowadays, but theoretically will invest in promoting cycling in a voluntary way in schools. But I do want to add two ideas related to that. First of all is from the focus group, we have a student, one or two, I don't remember, who said that when she was younger, she used to go to school in the bicycle, but as she grow older, the conditions, the time, the conditions in the school as well wasn't the best, so she stopped. But she also said that one of her teachers started to use the bicycle in the school, and that promotes in the school an environment that can that from her point of view made her colleagues go to bicycle as well, because the teacher as a reference made that possible. The other thing that, and this is related with Paula said earlier, with the way that in Portugal too, because of our history, we will relate bicycle as poverty and power relations that symbolize that poverty. The other thing I think is important to think, and I'm here thinking about Arendt, for example, that thought that in the ancient education, the simple fact of talking about justice make us more just, even if we don't create an idea, a formal idea of justice or a universal idea of justice, but the thinking and the talking and the reflection made us more just. So if you can make the bicycle the same in the schools to have a space to think about that, to think about mobility, even if you don't make something that the students must have, but they have the opportunity to think. I think that they will be more probably to use and to make a possibility to integrate the bicycle in their daily lives. I don't think I answered.
Oh, you did. Thank you, Pedro.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pedro. That was a great answer. And I've got one now. Actually, is for everyone. This from the start. Actually, Graham's put this one down to Ian, but also everyone else about the media. Graham, did you want to ask this one yourself, or me too?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Yeah, the question is about, so drawing on Ian's comments about the media, I just wondered really how this varies by country. So is the characterization that you're talking about, Ian, is that unique or specific to the UK? Do different countries, does the media in different countries treat cycling differently?
Well, I think there's a chapter by Zach Johnson, I think it's in Peter Horton's book, about the US, and he very much reflected what I was seeing, that kind of marginalization. He used the example of Ferris Bueller, you know, that very cartoonish kind of depiction of cyclists. But then again, you know, when you talk about kind of normalizing this, Chris Rosselli in Australia looked at a metropolitan area and the representations of cyclists there were much more positive. So context is quite important.
Great, thank you, Ian.
Can I comment on
Absolutely.
that?
Yes, please.
Quickly. Yeah, it's something also quite important here in Colombia, in terms of reporting on crashes. Often there's still very much a tendency to focus on you know, the things the cyclist did wrong, and to kind of avoid the agency of drivers in many cases. So the car crashes into somebody, you know, collided with, without talking about the driver. So this has happened in quite often the case here in Colombia. And I think this also speaks to perhaps the education we were just talking about with Pedro. There's also a massive process of learning or unlearning even to be done within the media to kind of frame discussions about collisions, infrastructure, many other topics in a different way, in a way that you know, kind of recognizes the unique vulnerabilities and behaviors necessary for cyclists. Here in Colombia, in many cases, cyclists are forced to take big roads. You know, there's no way to avoid them in many cases, especially when you're leaving the city. So, and often you find yourself on the left side of the road for many reasons, and then this becomes a reason to blame the cyclists. Well, you know, go ahead and take a bike and try to do this without being on the left side of the road. It's very hard. So there's this kind of bias towards drivers, this kind of windshield bias. And it's common here, even though a very small minority of Colombians are actually car drivers. So I think this speaks to it. And there's been some research done by Camilo Torres on media representations of cyclists here in Bogota, which is also interesting in terms of the ways that certain areas of the city are talked about in certain ways, which speaks to the segregation, social segregation in Latin American cities, that also influences in the way that, you know, certain cyclists perhaps are more privileged because they are in certain areas of the city. There's more attention to crashes in certain areas of the city, whereas the areas of the city which are actually most dangerous for cyclists are the lower income areas. Infrastructure is poor. It's almost obligatory to mix with heavy traffic, with trucks, and then there's much less attention to those kind of environmental factors, and there's much more attention to, oh, the cyclists are irresponsible. They don't know how to use a bike. They should be on the cycling infrastructure. So I think there's a lot to be changed in terms of also the media attention to cyclists. And in the Espacio and NGO I've worked for, we've also worked on workshops for journalists. So helping journalists understand road safety, not only cyclists, but road safety in general, and to frame it in different ways. And I think that's a very important part of the work to be done here.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I can just see that, Ian, you've got your hand up as well. Is that an old hand or
No,
it's a new hand?
They're both old hands, Nick. No, it was just to support Thomas's point about the personification of cars in the media. You know, they've changed the reporting guidelines for accidents recently, haven't they, around that? But that is something I've seen in my second study, which is discourse analysis. That is a general trend in how people talk about cars, that personification and that removal of agency that you don't get when they're talking about cyclists. There's much more responsibility put on the cyclist.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the time being 4 minutes to the hour, I just want to do a quick round the room again. And just a very general question, but maybe one that you've thought of already. In terms of your research or your project that you've presented here today and you've discussed, what would you like to see next? Basically, what are the questions? What might someone else come along and do to kind of build on it? I'll start off with Paola, because you're first on my screen, I'm afraid.
Yeah, sure. I really would like to see more research about subsistence cycling mobilities, everyday cycling and subsistence cycling. And I always take the opportunity to mention Claudio's work on this topic, because I think it's wonderful and it takes a step in that direction, and seeing how what we call popular cycling or working class cycling takes place. And I think that's a very important and worthy area of research. So I would love to dip my toes into that in the future, but hopefully other people will too.
That's great. Thank you very much. Ian?
Yeah, I think from a social identity perspective, it's that understanding of what is critical mass. You know, how many people, how normalized do we need cycling to be for it to be adopted as it is in the Netherlands? You know, what is that point and how much does it need? Because I think that would go a long way to convincing local politicians that it's worthwhile.
Great, thank you very much. Thomas?
Yeah, so I'm just starting out on my PhD, so this is exactly what I have to think about now. You know, which direction is the research going? But one of the things that has most interested me, particularly here in Colombia, is this kind of politics of here they call it cicloruta sí, pero no así. So yes, to cycling infrastructure. We want cycling infrastructure. No, it's not controversial. Everyone wants more cycling. But the question is, how do we do it? So people say, we don't want it like that. Not this way. Do it another way. Of course, there's never a real alternative presented. People are just against the project. But you know, I think this is a very interesting topic. It's kind of a NIMBYism, I guess. But on the one hand, you know, how can cycling be so, you know, uncontroversial? Basically, anyone wants more of it. But on the other hand, as soon as you start changing the system, changing the transport system, you know, how do those conflicts play out? And I think that's you know, the real question now is, you know, how do we change these transport systems? We know we want to. How do we change it?
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, that paradox is highly interesting area to research. And last but not least, Pedro.
Well, we are starting now to look at the focus group, so we are going to continue the work in that. Personally, I think I'm most interested in thinking about the relation between bicycle and education in a broader sense. I didn't say that before, but we had an experience with heritage master students about routines, bicycle routines in Porto from the historical point of view, like a way of promoting education about history, heritage, geographic within the bicycles. And I think that is important to look forward and to see how the public reacts and how the students also react to that as a pedagogical extra strategy. I want also to see how the bicycle in the schools with the students can promote an holistic education related to all the sorts of the human being, exactly as a body-mind process and not only related to one of them. And the bicycle has that potential. I think is that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see we're just on the hour now. I just want to thank you all for, first of all, developing amazing videos and projects as well to share with us, and for all the answers that you've given to these questions. And just to say also to the audience, I've been trying to monitor the chat and look at the questions. I know I've missed a couple. So perhaps if that's the case, you could pass your questions on to the presenters and they'll be able to answer them. If we were in the room together, we'd be able to do a round of applause. Unfortunately, we can't do that. I'm going to clap, and I'm sure it's claps from everyone else. And thanks, everyone. You can see the schedule there. There's one more session today, and then there's also a social session. So we look forward to seeing you later. Thank you very much.